What if I told you that a brutal murder on Christmas Day in 1863 became one of the most important teaching cases in the history of forensic science? Not because it was solved, but precisely because of how investigators failed, adapted, and pioneered techniques we still use today. This is the story of how Victorian detectives, faced with a locked room, a missing killer, and blood-soaked evidence they barely understood, accidentally invented the future of criminal investigation. Most true crime content walks you through what happened. Today, we're doing something different. We're going inside the investigation itself, examining every forensic decision, every investigative technique, every breakthrough and blunder that occurred when Metropolitan Police confronted a murder that pushed the boundaries of everything they knew about catching killers. By the end of this deep dive, you'll understand not just how modern forensic science works, but why it had to be invented in the first place. The Harriet Buswell case of 1863 represents a pivotal moment, a bridge between the ancient art of manhunting and the scientific revolution that would transform criminal justice. Let's explore how this single investigation changed everything. Let's start with the fundamental problem that faced Superintendent Thompson when he arrived at number 12 Great Coram Street on Christmas Day, 1863. A woman lay murdered in a locked room. A witness describes seeing her enter with a foreign gentleman around midnight. By morning, she was dead and he was gone. Now, if this happened today, what would modern investigators do first? They'd secure the crime scene with barrier tape, photograph everything from multiple angles, collect DNA samples, fingerprint every surface, check security cameras for the suspect's movements, run facial recognition, pull phone records, and have forensic results back within hours. Superintendent Thompson had none of this. Absolutely none of it. Photography existed, but crime scene photography was still experimental and rarely used. Fingerprinting wouldn't be systematically applied to criminal investigations for another 40 years. DNA analysis wouldn't exist for over a century. The scientific method itself was barely applied to criminal justice. So what could he do? What tools did Victorian investigators actually possess when confronted with physical evidence of murder? This is where the Buswell case becomes fascinating from a forensic perspective, because we can watch investigators improvise, experiment, and slowly build the foundation of techniques we take for granted today. The crime scene at Great Coram Street contained several crucial pieces of physical evidence, and how investigators handled each one reveals the state of forensic science at this critical transitional moment. First, there was the body itself. The police surgeon examined Harriet Buswell and noted that her throat had been cut with such violence that the blade reached the bone. He observed what he called a hand impression on her forehead, concluding that someone had held her down during the attack. Now, this might seem like basic observation, but what the surgeon was actually doing here was pioneering what we now call wound pattern analysis. He wasn't just seeing injuries, he was reading them as evidence of the killer's actions, reconstructing the sequence of violence from the physical traces it left behind. This approach, analyzing wound characteristics to understand the mechanics of an attack, would eventually evolve into an entire forensic subdiscipline. Modern forensic pathologists can determine the type of weapon used, the approximate force applied, the angle of attack, whether the victim was standing or prone, whether they struggled or were incapacitated, and often whether the killer was right or left-handed, all from wound patterns. The police surgeon in 1863 was taking the very first steps down this road, though he lacked the systematic framework and statistical backing that modern practitioners possess. But here's where it gets really interesting. The investigators found a partially eaten apple at the scene. The apple had bite marks that clearly did not match Harriet Buswell's teeth. Think about what this means. Someone else had bitten into this apple, presumably the killer. That bite represented physical evidence, a unique impression left by the perpetrator's body. The question was, could it be used to identify him? What the investigators did next was remarkable. They made a cast of the bite marks. They created a three-dimensional reproduction of the dental impressions in that apple, preserving them for comparison against any suspect they might find. This was forensic odontology, the science of using dental evidence in criminal investigations, and it was being attempted in 1863, decades before the field would be formally recognized. Now, let's be clear about the limitations here. The investigators had no systematic database of dental records to search, no standardized method for comparing bite marks, no scientific literature on the reliability of bite mark evidence, no expert witnesses who specialized in this field because the field didn't exist yet. But they understood something fundamental. Unique physical characteristics can link a specific individual to a crime scene. They just didn't have the scientific infrastructure to exploit this insight effectively. This is a pattern we'll see repeatedly in the Buswell case. Victorian investigators grasped key concepts of forensic science, but lacked the systematic methodology to apply them reliably. They were inventing the discipline in real time, one improvisation at a time. Consider the blood-stained towels and handkerchiefs found scattered around the room. Today, these would be carefully collected, each item placed in a separate evidence bag to prevent cross-contamination, documented with photographs showing exactly where each piece was found, then sent to a forensic laboratory for blood pattern analysis. Technicians would determine whose blood was on each item, whether it had been smeared, dripped, or sprayed, what this pattern revealed about the position of the victim and attacker, and whether any trace evidence like hair or fibers had transferred during the attack. In 1863, investigators could do almost none of this. They could observe that the towels were blood-stained. They could theorize that the killer might have used them to clean himself, but they couldn't prove whose blood it was. They couldn't definitively connect these items to the killer rather than the victim. Blood typing wouldn't be discovered for another 40 years. Serology, the science of bodily fluid analysis, was in its infancy. The investigators were looking at crucial evidence they simply didn't have the scientific knowledge to interpret. And yet, they were asking the right questions. Why were multiple towels blood-stained? Had the killer cleaned himself at the scene, suggesting premeditation and a cool head rather than panicked flight? Or had he attempted to clean the scene itself, perhaps to obscure evidence? These questions about perpetrator behavior, about what physical evidence reveals about the criminal's state of mind and methodology, these are fundamentally modern forensic questions, even though the scientific tools to answer them definitively didn't yet exist. The locked door presented another mystery. Victorian investigators understood that the locked door, with the key removed from outside, suggested premeditation. This wasn't a crime of passion where the killer fled in panic. This was someone who maintained enough control after committing murder to lock the door and remove the key, either to delay discovery of the body or to create a puzzle for investigators. Reading the scene for behavioral evidence for what the staging of the crime reveals about the perpetrator. This is what modern investigators call criminal profiling, though they didn't have that term in 1863. So we have Victorian investigators who are conceptually grasping toward modern forensic methods, but operating without the scientific foundation that makes those methods reliable. They're collecting physical evidence but can't scientifically analyze it. They're observing patterns but can't statistically validate them. They're theorizing about perpetrator behavior but can't systematically study it. This gap between concept and capability is what makes the Buswell case so revealing about the evolution of forensic science. Now, let's talk about what the Victorians could do well. Witness identification. This was their primary investigative tool, and they deployed it with remarkable sophistication. When the investigation led them to the German ship Wangerland, they didn't just grab a suspect and hope for the best. They organized what we would now call a lineup, bringing multiple witnesses from London to identify potential suspects from among the ship's complement. This sounds straightforward, but think about what it required. Coordinating multiple witnesses, some of whom had seen the suspect only briefly and under poor lighting conditions. Ensuring the identification procedure was reasonably fair, so the suspect couldn't later claim he'd been unfairly singled out. Managing the witnesses so they didn't influence each other's identifications. These procedural concerns about the reliability of eyewitness identification are still debated hotly today. What happened at the Wangerland identification parade reveals both the strengths and catastrophic weaknesses of relying on eyewitness testimony. 5 of 7 witnesses positively identified Dr. Gottfried Hessel, the ship's chaplain, as the man seen with Harriet Buswell on Christmas Eve. 5 out of 7. That's a strong majority. Multiple independent witnesses selecting the same person from a group of similar men. By the standards of the time, this seemed like powerful evidence, but there was a problem, a massive problem that wouldn't be fully understood for more than a century. The witnesses were competing for a substantial reward. £300, equivalent to roughly £30,000 today. And as Hessel's defense attorney pointed out in a statement that brought applause from the courtroom, the witnesses before you have been photographed not by the aid of the sun or the gaslight, but by the reward. This is actually one of the most prescient observations in 19th century criminal justice. What the defense attorney was identifying, though he couldn't have articulated it in these terms, was contamination of witness memory through external incentives. Modern cognitive psychology research has demonstrated definitively that memory is far more malleable than Victorians understood. Witnesses who have a financial or emotional incentive to identify someone are significantly more likely to make false, positive identifications. The reward, rather than motivating accurate testimony, was potentially corrupting the very evidence the investigation depended upon. Even without understanding the cognitive side, Victorian judges and juries had an intuitive grasp that something was wrong with incentivized identification. When Dr. Hessel presented an alibi, corroborated by witnesses who placed him ill in bed at his hotel on Christmas Eve, the magistrate decided the identification evidence was insufficient. The man was discharged without even facing trial. Now, from a modern forensic perspective, what happened here? The investigation relied almost entirely on the one type of evidence Victorian police could gather reliably: human testimony. But they had no way to assess the reliability of that testimony scientifically. No understanding of how stress affects memory formation, how suggestive questioning can contaminate recall, how confidence and accuracy are often unrelated in eyewitness accounts, how cross-racial identification has higher error rates, or how financial incentives can unconsciously bias memory. Modern forensic science emerged partly because cases like Buswell demonstrated the desperate need for objective, physical evidence that didn't depend on the fallible human memory and motivated testimony. You can lie about what you saw. You can misremember what happened. Your perception can be distorted by stress, poor lighting, brief exposure time, or unconscious bias. But blood doesn't lie. DNA doesn't misremember. Fingerprints don't have financial incentives, except, and here's the crucial lesson, physical evidence only tells the truth when you have the scientific knowledge to interpret it correctly. The bite mark in the apple was objective physical evidence, but without forensic odontology standards, it couldn't conclusively identify anyone. The blood-stained towels were real physical traces of the crime, but without serology, they couldn't be definitively linked to the killer. The wound patterns on Harriet Buswell's body were factual observations, but without systematic wound analysis methodology, different observers might interpret them differently. This is why the Buswell case is so important in forensic history. It sits at this critical inflection point where investigators understood they needed physical evidence but didn't yet have the scientific framework to use it effectively. The case exposed the limitations of witness testimony while simultaneously revealing the limitations of physical evidence when investigators lack the scientific tools to interpret it. Let's jump forward to the modern era for a moment and talk about how this case would be investigated today, because the contrast is staggering. The moment Harriet Buswell's body was discovered, the scene would be locked down. A forensic team would photograph and video record everything before anyone touched anything. They'd create a three-dimensional digital scan of the entire room, preserving the spatial relationships between every piece of evidence. Every item that might contain trace evidence would be carefully collected using techniques specifically designed to prevent contamination. The blood evidence alone would generate a wealth of information the Victorian investigators couldn't access. Forensic serologists would determine blood types. DNA analysts would create a genetic profile of the perpetrator from any blood that wasn't Harriet Buswell's. Blood pattern analysts would examine the spatters and smears to reconstruct exactly what happened, where everyone was positioned, how many blows were struck, and in what sequence. They could potentially determine the weapon characteristics from the blood spatter patterns, even if the weapon itself was never recovered. The bite mark in the apple, which Victorian investigators could only preserve in plaster, would be analyzed using advanced forensic odontology techniques. Dental impressions would be digitally scanned and compared against any suspect's teeth using software that can identify matches with high statistical confidence. More importantly, modern forensic scientists understand the limitations of bite mark evidence. We know that bite marks in flesh are highly unreliable because skin deforms and distorts, making definitive matches nearly impossible. But bite marks in solid food, like an apple, preserve more accurate impressions, making them potentially useful evidence when properly analyzed. The locked door, which only told Victorian investigators about potential premeditation, would yield much more information to modern forensic locksmiths and toolmark examiners. They could potentially determine what type of key was used, whether the lock had been picked or forced, and examine the door and frame for tool marks that might link to implements found in the suspect's possession. Perhaps most importantly, modern investigators wouldn't be searching blind for a German-speaking gentleman based solely on witness descriptions. They'd be checking security camera footage from the surrounding area, tracking the suspect's movements before and after the murder. They'd be analyzing phone records and digital communications. They'd be using facial recognition technology. They'd be coordinating with international law enforcement through Interpol. They'd be checking airline and ship passenger manifests systematically rather than pursuing leads haphazardly. The difference isn't just technological, it's also procedural and institutional. Modern forensic investigations follow standardized protocols that ensure evidence is collected, preserved, analyzed, and presented in court according to rigorous scientific standards. Chain of custody documentation tracks every piece of evidence from collection to trial. Forensic laboratories are accredited and must meet quality control standards. Expert witnesses must demonstrate their qualifications and their methods must be scientifically validated. Victorian investigators had none of this infrastructure. They were improvising procedures as they went, making reasonable guesses about what might constitute useful evidence, but without any systematic framework for ensuring their methods were scientifically sound. Now here's where the story takes a fascinating turn that reveals something profound about forensic investigation across time. In 2007, researcher Stanley Bruce proposed a theory connecting the Buswell murder to Wilhelm Krauss, a German man who signed onto a British ship called the Rifleman just 11 days after Harriet Buswell was killed. Krauss later murdered the ship's captain and was hanged in Australia in July 1864. Bruce's theory rests on several points of correlation. The timing is suspicious. A German man hastily departing England immediately after a German-speaking man murders someone in London. Krauss's demonstrated capacity for violence aligns with the brutality of Buswell's murder. His methods on the Rifleman, poisoning the crew before attempting to seize the ship, shows premeditation and cold calculation consistent with locking Buswell's door and removing the key. Bruce even suggests that the bite mark evidence from the apple could potentially be compared to Krauss's dental records since he was buried in Australia after his execution. From a forensic perspective, what Bruce was doing in 2007 was applying modern investigative methodology to a cold case from 1863. He was cross-referencing historical records, looking for patterns and connections across different crimes, applying statistical reasoning about the probability of these correlations occurring by chance. This is exactly what modern cold case investigators do with unsolved historical crimes. But here's the crucial point. Even with modern analytical methods, even with the benefit of 140+ years of hindsight, even with the ability to search historical records far more efficiently than Victorian investigators could, Bruce's theory remains unproven. It's plausible, compelling even, but not definitive. Why? Because the original investigation didn't collect and preserve evidence in ways that allow modern forensic analysis. The bite mark cast from the apple, if it still exists, has never been compared to any dental records of Wilhelm Krauss. And even if it were, would that comparison hold up to modern forensic standards? Bite mark evidence has come under severe scrutiny in recent decades. Multiple wrongful convictions have been overturned when DNA evidence contradicted bite mark identifications. The entire field of forensic odontology is being reconsidered and held to higher scientific standards. This reveals something important. Forensic science doesn't progress in a straight line from ignorance to perfect knowledge. It evolves through cycles of innovation, application, error recognition, and refinement. Victorian investigators invented bite mark analysis. 20th century forensic odontologists refined and expanded it. 21st century researchers discovered it had been overvalued and misapplied, leading to wrongful convictions. Now we're establishing more rigorous standards for when and how bite mark evidence should be used. The same pattern appears across forensic science. Hair microscopy was once considered reliable for identifying individuals. Then, DNA analysis revealed it had led to numerous wrongful convictions. Blood spatter analysis was treated as near infallible. Then researchers demonstrated that expert testimony often went far beyond what the science could actually support. Fingerprint examination was long considered absolutely certain. Then, studies showed that examiners' judgments could be influenced by contextual information about the case. The Buswell case captures forensic science at its beginning, when investigators first grasped that physical evidence could be more reliable than human testimony, but didn't yet understand how to analyze that evidence scientifically. We're now over 150 years past that moment, and we're still learning, still refining, still discovering that techniques we thought were reliable have hidden flaws. Let me close by talking about what the Buswell case ultimately teaches us about the evolution of forensic science and its role in criminal justice. First, it demonstrates that forensic science emerges from practical necessity. Victorian investigators developed bite mark casting not because they had a theoretical framework for forensic odontology, but because they had a bite mark and needed some way to preserve and potentially use it as evidence. They were solving problems as they encountered them, creating the foundation of forensic science through accumulating practical experiences. Second, it shows that forensic science progresses through recognizing and correcting errors. The failures of the Buswell investigation, the inability to conclusively identify the killer despite having physical evidence, helped drive the development of more sophisticated techniques. Similarly, modern recognition that bite mark evidence has led to wrongful convictions is driving more rigorous standards today. Science advances by finding and fixing mistakes. Third, it reveals the fundamental tension in forensic science between the demand for certainty and the reality of probability. Legal systems want forensic science to provide definitive answers. Is this the killer's fingerprint or not? Does this DNA match or not? Did this bullet come from this gun or not? But science deals in probabilities and confidence intervals. This tension existed in Victorian times when witnesses could be mistaken despite being confident, and it exists today when forensic evidence is powerful but not absolutely certain. Fourth, the case demonstrates how forensic science both shapes and is shaped by broader social and legal contexts. The public reaction to Dr. Hessel's arrest and release reveals how class, nationality, and respectability influence perceptions of evidence. Modern forensic science tries to be more objective, but it still operates within social contexts that influence how evidence is interpreted and valued. Finally, the unsolved nature of the Buswell case, even with modern analytical techniques applied in hindsight, reminds us that forensic science has limits. We've come extraordinarily far from the improvised investigations of 1863, but we haven't achieved perfect knowledge or perfect justice. We've built powerful tools, but we still make mistakes, still grapple with ambiguous evidence, still occasionally let the guilty go free or wrongly convict the innocent. The bite mark in that apple from Christmas 1863 represents both the promise and limitations of forensic science. Victorian investigators understood it was potentially valuable evidence. They innovated a method to preserve it, but they lacked the scientific framework to use it effectively. A century and a half later, we have sophisticated forensic odontology techniques, but we've also learned that bite mark evidence is far less reliable than we once thought. The bite mark remains, cast in plaster, somewhere in the archives if it still exists at all, a bridge between past and present, between what investigators hoped science could do and what it actually can do. When Harriet Buswell died on Christmas Day 1863, forensic science as we know it barely existed. When her probable killer, Wilhelm Krauss, hanged in Sydney 7 months later for a different murder, no one connected the crimes because the investigative infrastructure didn't exist to see the connection. When Stanley Bruce proposed the connection in 2007, he was applying forensic methodology that wouldn't be invented for decades after both murders occurred. This chain across time illustrates how forensic science evolved from improvisation to systematic methodology, from hunches to hypotheses, from individual observations to accumulated scientific knowledge. The next time you watch a crime drama where forensic scientists solve murders with absolute certainty in 42 minutes, remember the investigators standing in that blood-soaked room in Bloomsbury on Christmas Day 1863, looking at evidence they didn't know how to read, applying techniques they were inventing on the spot, trying desperately to catch a killer with tools we'd consider hopelessly primitive. Remember that everything those television forensic scientists do confidently and quickly today exists because generations of investigators confronted their limitations, recognized their mistakes, and slowly, case by case, built the science we now depend upon. The Buswell murder wasn't solved in its time. It may never be definitively solved, but it wasn't wasted. Every limitation exposed, every technique attempted, every failure recognized, contributed to the development of methods that have solved countless murders since. That's the real legacy of the case. Not the individual crime, but what investigators learn from failing to solve it. Victorian murder, modern methodology, enduring mysteries. The Harriet Buswell case bridges past and present, reminding us that forensic science isn't a fixed body of knowledge, but an evolving discipline, constantly refining its methods, questioning its assumptions, and expanding its capabilities. From a bite mark in an apple to DNA profiles in blood, from plaster casts to three-dimensional laser scans, from eyewitness lineups to facial recognition algorithms, the journey has been remarkable. But the fundamental challenge remains the same: using physical evidence and scientific reasoning to discover truth about violent crime. We're better at it now than Superintendent Thompson was in 1863, but we're not done learning. If you found this deep dive into forensic evolution valuable, I'd appreciate your support for more content exploring how modern, investigative techniques developed from historical cases. The intersection of criminal history and scientific methodology reveals surprising lessons about both how far we've come and how far we still have to go in the pursuit of justice through science. Thanks for watching. If you found value in this video, please hit the like button. It really helps the channel. And if you want to see more, check out this video right here. See you in the next one.